선생님 혹시 계세요? 음,
uh, about 10 years in, so that we inherit the characteristics of the heritage decision making.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our participants around the world who are joining us online. Welcome to the Global Consortium for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage 2022. I'm Boram Shin, International Relations Coordinator of the International Heritage Education Center at the Korean National University of Cultural Heritage. I will be your moderator for today. Before we start, I would like to inform you that this fifth annual meeting of GCPCH is being recorded and live streaming on our KNUCH and KNUCH IHEC YouTube channels. The whole program will be held in Korean and English. Our KNUCH YouTube channel will provide Korean and the KNUCH IHEC channel will be in English. Okay. I would like to share our schedule for today's event first. In the morning session, we will have two presentations with topic 1, Global State of Conservation, Restoration of Tangible and Intangible Heritage, and a discussion panel at the end. In session second will be start at 5 p.m. Korean Standard Time. We will have 4 presentations and a panel discussion with topic 2, Global Conservation Training Programs, Guiding Principles, Contents, Values. And in session 3, topic 3, Protecting Heritage Under Stress, we will have 3 presentations and a discussion panel. I would like to invite Professor Young-jae Kim to the stage for the opening speech. Professor Kim is the head of the International Heritage Center and the chairperson of GCPCH 2022. Professor Kim, the floor is yours.
Distinguished GCPCH Steering Committee, Professor, Researcher, and Student, I'm delighted to welcome the 5th GCPCH Consortium. On behalf of the Korean National University of Cultural Heritage as a host University of GCPCH 2022. I would like to appreciate all for joining to online consortium from every corner of the globe. I believe that your presence here is a clear demonstration of your strong passion for cultural heritage. Today, this consortium will provide us with the opportunity to look back on our journey and, in so doing, help us move forward. We will share our respective experience as we seek to pour our wisdom on how to deliver the best result. Finally, we will discuss and announce the host of GCPCH 2023 for keeping our vision for the future. I'm now the honor to declare the 5th GCPCH Consortium on Heritage open. Thank you so much for everyone.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kim, for your warm and friendly welcoming remarks. We will now move on to the first section. First, we invite Dr. Soo-jung Lee to the floor. Dr. Soo-jung Lee is the head of the Research and Development Office, International Center for the Interpretation and the Presentation of World Heritage Sites under the auspice of UNESCO. She will be presenting the conservation principles, integrating international principles into local practice. Please welcome Dr. Lee to the floor.
Hello, everyone. I am Soo-jung Lee from WIPIC. WIPIC is the UNESCO's World Heritage Interpretation and Presentation International Center. I have been working for the government for the last 13 years since my PhD from the University of York, and I joined to the WIPIC as a kind of research staff. So I am responsible of the research office and also the archiving office in our center at the moment. Today, I would like to share with you about my thought, knowledge, and experience on conservation principle. Because of the time gap, I would like to tell you about my presentation at home, and then I will move to my office for the morning to share with you and to discuss with you in the discussion session. Through this presentation, I'd like to share with you about the very brief history of the conservation in Korea from the colonial period up to now. And then I probably will address some of the problems and issues that we found in the process of decision making, so that we realize the need of the conservation principle in our practice. And then I will talk about the process of drafting out the conservation principle and the dilemmas of integrating international principles into the local practice. When it has been started, the concept and the need of conservation of cultural heritage in Korea, I would say maybe officially started from the colonial period. Yes, of course, before 1910, we did have a quite modern law to protect conservation principle, to protect heritage as historical remains. But because of the Japanese annexation in 1910, we haven't developed our ideas on how to conserve and what to conserve during the colonial periods by ourselves. So with the Japanese authority, we have started the survey, excavation, dismantling and repair process, and also we set out the legal frameworks to comply with the Japanese domestic law. As you can see here on the photo, they did have a lot of survey, and some of the survey has been done by the foreign dispatch. And also some of very important heritage sites, as you can see in the middle photos here, has been dismantled by the Japanese authority without remaining any reports, without any remaining detailed process of how they do it and what they did it and why they did it, so that it became a big dilemma in Korea to understand what has been done on the important heritage sites. And also there has been lots of excavations during the colonial period, so that many of the artifacts has been illegally exported to Japan and has been possessed by the Japanese museum up to now. And then we experienced the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. So in those times, many of the heritage sites has been targeted of bomb attacks by both North and South, and also the United Armies. And through those kind of process, many of the heritage sites has been destroyed totally or sometimes partially destroyed, and it has been remained as you can see in this photo, unrepaired and unrecovered. So we did have a lot of problems and challenges through the 1950s up to 1960s to talk about the post-war reconstruction. And also we realized the importance of research of the buildings and research of the how to reconstruct and recover the damaged heritage. And also based on the Japanese law, which has been enacted during the colonial period, we have revised the legal frameworks, and also we started to make the national list of heritage based on the Japanese list. During 1970s and 1980s, we went through the economic growth, but still we had a very unstable experience on political issues. We had the military regime, so that during this process, some of the heritage sites has been excavated by a very straightforward decision by the president, so that without any knowledge on the techniques and the scientific evidence, many of the sites has been excavated in those times. So we started to think about the constructive planning, and also budget has been increased, and also there has been a lot of setup of national institute, such as the National Research Institute of Cultural Heritage, or some of the functions to deal with the scientific progress and the examinations and systematic survey on the making the heritage list. And also there has been a lot of publications, such as the excavation reports, conservation reports, and also the midterm and long-term plan. And then we have started international exchange, and also we developed the area management. From 1990s up to present, we had a big growth in economics, and also after 1980s and 1990s, we went through the political stabilizations with the civil government, so that most of the heritage sites has been opened and also has been appreciated by the publics in those times. There has been still continuous reconstructions to recover the war damage, and also there has been a big development on conservation science, and we started the risk management because of the fire of the National Treasure Number 1, which I'm going to talk about it with you in the next slide. And then we have developed new technology on how to share the heritage. A lot of the mobile technology has been developed, so that we could actually invite the public to involve in decision making, to involve in enjoying the heritage sites. Recent progress we made is the management of setting. As you can see here in this map, this is the one heritage site in Korea. Actually, as you can see, the red colored area is the designated heritage site nationally. And as you can see in this map, there has been several heritage sites which has been designated by the government. And also there has been different colors around the heritage site to actually manage the settings of the designated heritage sites. As you can see in this color, the red color means the designated national heritage site area, and different colors has a kind of limit of the different levels of the development that government allow. Still, we do have a kind of area management system, so that we deal with the setting conservation, and also we deal with the also the sustainable development issues around the heritage site. In this kind of map, we do have each heritage site open the archives, so that anyone who owns their land around the heritage site, or maybe within the heritage site, can see what kind of development is allowed without the government permission, and what kind of development should get the government permissions around the heritage site. But in 2000, I think it was 2008, the National Treasure Number 1 has been burnt down by the old arson. He has a big complaint against the government policy, especially on his land, because in the process of purchasing his land for the road construction by the local government, he believes that his land has been sold out in a very cheap price. So he had a big complaint against the government policy, especially on heritage, so that he went into the National Treasure number 1 in the middle of night and he put the fire, so that as you can see on the photo on the right, the National Treasure number 1, the timber construction has been almost totally burned down. Actually, National Treasure number 1, which is the south gate of the old capital area of Seoul City, has been many damages, not only the colonial period, but also in the process of the Korean War, as you can see on the top, bottom left. It has been damaged because of the bombardment and because of the gunfire during the Korean War. And then we went through the massive conservation project to recover the war damage. And then about 20 years back, that we went through the another destructions by the fire. After the fire, there has been a lot of debate in Korea that how to reconstruct and what to reconstruct the National Treasure number 1. There has been a lot of philosophical issues that we started to talk on what, why, and how to conserve in the process of the making the conservation plan or reconstruction plan of this site. Another dilemma that we faced with in recent years is the wall painting conservation. As you can see on the left, we do have the wall paintings in the Buddhist temple, actually in the main buildings of the Buddhist compound. We do have a lot of problems in building because of the timber construction, timber structures, so that we often use the dismantling process and reassembling process to repair the structural problems of the timber buildings. In those processes, we have to dismantle the clay wall or sometimes the paper wall, as you can see in this photo. Then after dismantling, but in the process of reassembling, it is really difficult to put those wall painting back to the building because of the technical problem. So most of the cases that once the dismantled wall painting cannot be reassembled, cannot be back into the original position to the building after the repair. So there are so many wall paintings has been damaged, has been disappeared during the process of conservation, during the process of repairing the buildings. But as you can see in this building in recent years, that wall painting, which has been made of the paper and the natural pigments, has been dismantled. And then because of the conservation, because of the managing the pigments of the wall painting, this has a kind of new way of preserving in the Buddhist temple, not in the original place of the wall of the building. As you can see here, that it turned out into a scroll painting, so that it doesn't work as a kind of wall painting anymore. In that decision, there has been a kind of public outcry and the parliamentary critics about the decision making. Again, we have a kind of faced with what kind of decision making process is needed, but most of all, what kind of principles that we do need in such kind of decision making process has been a big issue for us. And also this stupa, Buddhist stupa, shows another issues on the needs of the conservation principles in Korea in recent years. The one on the left shows the stupa in the original place, which is North Korea at the moment. And then this stupa during the colonial period, it has been dismantled and shipped to Japan by the boat to be possessed by the private owners of the Japanese high class. And then during the Japanese colonial period, because of the public complaints in Korea and the very political issues, it returned back to Korea by the boat again, but it didn't go back to the original place. It landed into the palace area in South Korea in Seoul, so that it went through a kind of relocation or from the original place. And then after conservation project for 10 years, this stupa was decided to place in the National Museum of Korea in Yongsan. As you can see here, the original place is very much important, especially for this kind of Buddhist stupa, a religious monument for the kind of Buddhist practice. But because of the relocations and because of the stories in the inner places in the National Museum, it became a kind of object, not a kind of religious place anymore, so that it provoked a kind of discussion on what kind of criteria we do need in such kind of decision makings in recent years. I believe that we, when we set out the policy, then we do need a certain requirement. First of all, we do need a vision, and then we do need a direction. To make it possible that we do need political tools, and also we do need administrative tools. But for the last 50 years, since the Korean War, since the independence from the colonial period, we face with a lot of dilemmas on the philosophical issues, so that we have a lack of vision, we have a lack of directions in policy foundations. We did have a very advanced policy tools, but again, the platform of the philosophical issues, we have been experienced a lot of lack of those kind of areas. I believe that there has been a kind of certain area in policy, principle, and ethics. Philosophy is the area to think about why to preserve, what to preserve, and how to preserve. And then through this process, we can have the conservation principle, which is the methodology and criteria of decision making. Going through philosophical process on understanding why, what, and how, and drafting out the conservation principle is the process. And to take those kind of process is conservation ethics. So through this process, we set out why, what, and how to preserve, and practicing principle, which has been agreed through logical thinking and the logical way of doing it. So that through this process, we can actually make a kind of rational decision makings at the end, and that is the conservation ethics. Heritage and conservation, the concept of it has been changed over time. And now we do understand heritage, not only the material remains, but also the past, present, future generations' heritage. And also we understand heritage as a resource to improve the quality of life. It is a public resource, so that all our decisions, including conservation, is the public decision making. And that process is not only freezing the historical remains and historical evidence, but also we understand is a social process to make a rational decision making. And that is value-based practice again. When we understand heritage as a resource, managing change is very much important, sustaining values is very much important, so that we can benefit the community in sustainable development. Those kind of concept has been already implemented in Western countries, such as in the UK, so that they understand heritage. I mean, the historic environment is a shared resource, and understanding value, I mean, the sum of the value, which is the significance, is very much important in their conservation principles. And also the Australian Bharat Charter, conservation is very much important social process, so that they do have a kind of process to take. In each process, they do have the conservation principles as well. And the cycle of value-based approach can be divided into 3 steps. The first one is identifying value, the second one is managing values, and the third one is sharing values. And in each process, we do need a conservation principle, such as in the process of the identifying value, we do need a criteria for identifying value. In the process of the managing value, we do need a principle for decision making in value management. And in the process of sharing values, we do need a principles for that as well. Through those kind of principles, at the end, we can make a kind of rational decision making at the end. We realize those kind of international principles and international way of thinking, that we would like to solve some of the Korean issues, which has been actually addressed as a kind of principal issues. We had a colonial remains, so that there is a lot of dilemmas whether we have to remove it or not. In this case, as you can see, the colonial authority building has been removed for the reconstruction of the palace. And then we remained the top of the building to the Independence Hall, so that we have a kind of very associative social values, which is a negative feelings against the colonial remains. But those kind of values and those kind of emotional way of understanding the heritage values has been changed for the last 10 years. This is again the Japanese colonial building. When the city has removed this building for the new building, the public outcry has been criticizing the decision of dismantling the backside of the municipal government building, so that we decided to protect this building as it was in the process of constructing the new municipal government buildings. Again, we do have the dilemmas of what is the important element to express the values and to deliver the values in Korean heritage sites. As you can see in this building on the left, there are 2 long buildings to storage the Tripitaka Kriana, the Buddhist text, the Buddhist wooden blocks of the Buddha's teaching, so that if this temple is we call the Dharma temple, which delivers the Buddha's teaching in this temple for the long period of time. So those kind of 2 long buildings in this temple and the location of the Tripitaka Kriana is very much important, so that it is not a kind of single building that we have to think of in decision making, but also the layout, the location and setting is very much important in preserving and conserving the Korean heritage site. And those kind of elements is very much important in conserving actually the essence and the significance and the meanings and the values of the Korean heritage site. And we had a kind of dilemmas based on the international principles, how we can actually consider those kind of very Korean-based way of element of the values and the significance of the sites becomes very important issues for us. And again, in this temple, the wholeness is very much important, that all those 4 wall paintings should be intact in one building as a main building to deliver the Buddhist philosophy to the publics and also the religious community. So during the conservation process, it is really important for us to intact those kind of wholeness, so that it is a kind of essential requirement in considering the, or maybe in setting out the conservation principles in Korea. So this year, we started to set out the conservation principle of cultural heritage. And we have the draft at the moment, and it is about to be announced at the end of December in Korean and also in English in next year. The structure of these conservation principles has all 5 chapters. And as you can see here, we tried to have a kind of international way of structures so that we understand heritage conservation as a process of doing it. So in chapter 1, we had the conservation principles, which is from Article 2 to Article 7, to reflect international principles, but also the Korean characteristics in this principle. And then the first step we put is to understand the values and applying those kind of values. And then we describe the conservation principles. And then we have the chapter 4 for conservation measures. And in chapter 5, management and sharing sharing principles in this chapter. In this conservation principle, the most important thing was for us is how to deal with the Korean way of addressing the values and conserving values based on the international principle. Based on the international principle, we understand value is very much important, and that is the first step. So there is a value, but actually, as you know, the value is too abstract. So we did put a kind of what kind of elements and requirements to express the value, to understand the value, and also to conserve the values. In the World Heritage System, we call attributes. So we use those kind of attribute concept, and also we use another concept of the authenticity and integrity as a requirement to express those kind of attributes at the end, the values at the end. So again, the structure of the principle that we should understand the values, and we have to identify value. To do that, we do need to find out what is the attribute, what is the element to express the values and to deliver those kind of values. But again, those elements should have a certain condition, should have the certain requirement that we can prove those kind of elements can deliver the values to express the values. So we call it requirements. In our conservation principles, that we express those kind of structures in, but we reflected the Korean characteristics of the heritage sites. In Article 2, we have placed the importance of the value-based conservation, and also in Article 3 that maintaining historic states, which is the combination of the requirements and the element to express the values and to deliver the values, is very much important, which has been written in Article 3. In Article 4, we put the authenticity, integrity, and sustainability. And then Article 5, we express the cautious approaches is very much important. And again, in Article 8, we describe the significance of values, diversity of values, and variability of values. And in from Article 9 and 10 and 11, we stated the values and also the importance of value assessment and also the importance of value-based conservation. And through this process, we realized that probably once we set out those kind of conservation principles, that probably will be possible to have the rational decision makings, such as in this process, we probably will think about that what is important in expressing the values of the buildings, not only the timber structures, but also the elements of it, which is the wall painting within the buildings. And also, again, those kind of wall painting conservation, which went through the dismantling in the Japanese colonial periods, and then it moved to the museums. And again, we have a kind of face of the problems of dismantling the wooden carrier, which has been done by Japanese colonial periods, whether it should be dismantled or whether it should not be dismantled is also the important issues. And then we probably can think about the what is the criteria of decision makings, especially value-based, whether those timber frame is part of the value of this heritage or not is very much important decision-making criteria for us. And those kind of problems that probably we can deal with through the conservation principles in future. And again, this issue, whether we have to make this a statue be stand up or not, is another philosophical issues that we have to go through the conservation principles, which will be done in next year. Now we understand heritage as a process. Previously, all decision-making was done by experts on why, what, and how to deliver. But those kind of paradigm has been changed in recent years. Previously, we emphasized on the material aspects, and we divided the interest group into experts, visitors, and students previously. But now we understand heritage not as a thing, but as a process of intellectual, cognitive, and sensual experience of human. So heritage is not an object, but a cultural process to collect information, interpret values, which it manifests, and making meanings. The process of what we went through to understand international principle and the way of how to integrate those kind of international process to Korean conservation, Korean heritage sites, is also the part of the process for us. So we understand heritage as a process, then all those kind of process, not only the understanding the heritage, but also to conserve the heritage also becomes the process as well. Through this process, we respected the international principles, but we found out the essence of the Korean heritage and the different way of the understanding values and the different way of criteria that we make a decision in Korean heritage. And probably through this process, we probably can deal with the dilemmas and challenges that we have in decision makings at the end. Thank you very much for listening my presentations, and probably we will discuss more about during the discussion sessions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lee, for your presentation. The next presentation is Dr. Gladys Lehman from NICAS Research Associate. Today, she will be presenting toward a global infrastructure for heritage science or roadmap. We welcome Dr. Gladys Lehman to the floor. Dr. Gladys Lehman, the floor is yours.
Glenys, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry, the Zoom failed there, but now I'm unmuted. So just thank you very much, Ms. Shin, for that lovely introduction. And I would like to note that I am speaking on behalf of my 5 other colleagues who are noted here because it is the middle of the night for them over in Europe. But we are so honored to have presented at last year's GCPCH at the very beginning of our project, and we found that the discussions were very foundational to our development of the conception of our project. And we are very honored to return after a very busy 15 months and give you an update. So what have we spent the year on? We have titled our talk Toward a Global Infrastructure for Heritage Science, a Roadmap. So just a little bit of background about our project. We represent the first phase of a larger project. So the entire program is a 3-year multi-phase project. My colleagues and I represent the first phase, and that first phase ran from September 2021 to November 2022. And there were 6 research associates, all with one goal, which was creating a roadmap toward a global infrastructure for heritage science. So that's a lot of, that's a big task. And before I go into it a bit further, there is one very important definition that I would like to share with you, which is this term of heritage science. So at the beginning of our project, my colleagues and I decided to adopt a very broad, inclusive, and holistic definition that brings together very disciplines and types of expertise from the hard sciences, applied sciences, humanities, social sciences, and also including different forms of embodied knowledge and oral traditions. So really any kind of expertise, regardless of background or academic practice or not. And we were very much inspired by the definition that ICROM, so the International Center for the Study of the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, has shared for heritage science. So if you're unfamiliar with their definition, we encourage you to check that out. There's also, we will come back to this term science. As you can see here with some examples, science in the English language has developed this connotation of like physical applied sciences. But really when we use this term heritage science, again, we mean it to be broad and inclusive. So including skills like craftsmanship, indigenous knowledge, and the humanities, the human sciences as well. So with that said, another key part of introducing our project is I would like to tell you about my colleagues and I. And this is not only so you know who has worked on this project, but we found that the practice of autoethnography, so reflecting on our own backgrounds, our biases, was really important when we were trying to construct a truly global picture of the field. So you can see here, we have Tamar Hestrin-Grader, whose background is in historically informed performance practice and interdisciplinary art history. Merino Wild-Buisson, who is an art historian, curator of prints and drawings, and a printmaker. She also has dabbled in data science. We have Annalena de Groot, who is a technical art historian and textile conservation expert. Gaddis Fitriani-Putri, who is an artist and conservator. Maria Laura Petritzelis, who is a contemporary art conservator, and myself, who is trained as a conservation scientist. And so you'll see that all of our backgrounds largely represent the traditional triangle or 3-legged stool of conservation science. So coming from the art history, conservation, or science aspects. So while we are very multidisciplinary as a group, and we represent different socio-cultural backgrounds, we are not necessarily reflective of that broad view of the field that we really wanted to explore. We also do note that our group is predominantly white and predominantly comes from backgrounds biased towards Western Europe and North America. So part of our goal in creating the roadmap was really to try and speak with people and get perspectives that were outside of what our group of 6 represented. I would also like to note that at the original, in the original conception of this project, each of the 6 of us was assigned to a material category plus 1 time period, being modern and contemporary art. But as we launched into the project, we discovered that these kind of categories were a bit limiting. So they can be useful tools, but that maybe they were a bit too siloed for what we were attempting to do. And furthermore, these material categories obscured the importance of both the, not only the tangible, but also the intangible aspects of heritage. and really inspired by Mariette Westerman's keynote at last year's UCPH about how inextricably linked and inseparable the tangible and intangible are for cultural heritage. So with all of that said, we found it more useful to work together as a group and really tackling this big question of what is the state of the field now? And so what are the gaps and challenges, and how can we imagine a better future where we could really institute a global infrastructure to support heritage science work? And so also keeping in mind our own limitations, we decided that we would look outwards and speak with many different people. And we took both heritage science, the field and the concept and the work, as well as this concept of a global infrastructure as our common ground among the 6 of us research associates, and also as a boundary object. And in social and information sciences, boundary objects are entities that can link communities together because they allow different groups to collaborate on a common task. So that was really the starting point and kind of the touchstone for this project as we continued. So that's the background. Now, how did we go about creating this roadmap and really incorporating, or doing our best to incorporate a wider view of, or wider variety of perspectives and voices? So we settled on a qualitative data approach, really inspired by oral history techniques. And so our goal was that with 6 of us and initially 1 year that got extended to 15 months, how could we best really answer these big open questions? And so by speaking with a variety of conversationalists, we decided that each of these people we spoke to, their perspective and experiences would be kind of like these flashlights and illuminate pieces of the heritage science ecosystem. So really we were seeking to explore phenomena and relationships and patterns within the field, and really worked on using open-ended questions and allowed for flexibility in our approach, and approached our design of our methodology iteratively. And we found initially we started out with much more structured sort of interview type of an approach, but we found that really the richness of the data we gathered in much more free-flowing conversations was much more valuable. So I mentioned this research conversation, a little bit more about what that means, and we really did keep it very open-ended. So when we say semi-structured conversations, these lasted for about 1.5 hours, and as we maybe a third of the way or less of the way through our conversations, we really settled on some key questions that we asked everyone, and then everything else in the conversation we just kind of let it flow and allowed the people we were speaking with, as well as ourselves, to explore the ecosystem through the natural flow of conversation. So really a co-creation of this knowledge. And so to begin, we did I did a little bit of it this presentation, where we would introduce ourselves to our conversationalists so they knew who they were speaking to. And then we invited our conversationalists to introduce themselves in their own words. And particularly, we were interested in how did they come to the field of heritage science. And then we would ask, what are the main gaps and challenges that you see in the field? What are the possibilities that you see in the field? And what are you excited about? And then the free-flowing conversation was centered around broadly interdisciplinary collaboration and education, and it went where the conversation took us with that particular person. And from these conversations, which were recorded, we had transcripts, and we analyzed the transcripts, and that formed the body of data that is how we or formed the basis of our roadmap. So a little bit more about who we were able to speak to. So we held 44 semi-structured conversations in total with 51 participants. And these participants were from about 25 different disciplines and 37 different countries. And we made an effort as well to also speak to people at different career stages. So from students all the way up to senior level positions. And so you can see here from the map for where our conversationalists identified as their origin countries. you can see that in a year we didn't manage quite the scope we might have hoped, but hopefully we did manage to get an international sense of things at least a little bit, although we do recognize that countries are only one way of organizing information, and one person's experience is not a monolith or representative of everyone else's experience within that country. So just as a caveat there. So I've told you about who we did, who was doing this project and how we went about it. So what are the results from our project? So our roadmap is really grounded in the data that we gathered. And we really conceive of it as not a blueprint, but rather an invitation for discussion. So rather than giving directions between a known starting location and delineating the path forward to a known destination, we really see this as presenting a kaleidoscope of voices and perspectives, and really focused on being descriptive rather than prescriptive. And Dr. Lee's talk just beforehand is a perfect example. What might work in Korea to make those Korean values and those Korean ethics and principles of conservation might not work in another country. So really trying to mine what is useful and relevant without making our recommendations or what we wrote about be so rigid and strict that they wouldn't be applicable to people in a variety of circumstances. We also want our roadmap to be accessible, dynamic, and interactive. And although currently it is a linear written document, we want people to be able to interact with it in a very non-linear and choose your own adventure, if you will, manner. So we hope that it will be published online and really present an interactive platform for people to explore as they want. And again, we really hope that at some point it will develop so that the community can use it and add to it, and it can grow and be a resource. So with all of that said, we took all of our data and we kind of thought, how can we group the big findings? And we came up with this set of 8 themes with these icons shown here. So one is contemporary living heritage for living communities. And that really represents how we found that the contemporary art, time-based media was a very rich source of inspiration for all types of conservation, not just for the specific needs of contemporary art. We also have a theme called From Heritage Science to Heritage Care. And this is really partially a semantic move just to get away from the silos and connotations of science in the English language, but also as a term to really be more inclusive and include groups that like don't belong in academic disciplines or maybe aren't affiliated with an institution. Resources in many types of resources came up, and issues with access or opportunities for resources. We also, in speaking to a variety of people, found many interesting concepts around identity, diversity, and cross-cultural connection. And those identities and diversity can be within one individual or across groups, within institutions, and of course, across cultures. The next generation really speaks to not only the next generation of heritage care professionals, but also, again, what Dr. Lee spoke about, where how can we involve the future generations and public and in heritage decisions, be excited, see it as this driver of good. Networks of Care is a model where we, again, were inspired by contemporary art and really thinking about this non-hierarchical open structure where we could incorporate more knowledge in the care of heritage. We also have Heritage for Social Impact, which speaks to the relationship between heritage, society, and caretakers and professionals of heritage, as well as policymakers and government. So again, Dr. Lee's talk is really relevant to a lot of these themes that we came up with. And lastly, kind of tying all of these together in a sense, we have this idea that maybe we rethink ways of rethinking a global infrastructure. And so for the sake of time, I cannot go into much more detail, but I'm going to give you just a little bit of a taste of what these themes look like. So the next slide will go. Here we go. So every theme contains the following sections. So a summary, which is an introduction and kind of a brief abstract. Then the heart, most of where our data from our conversations is included is in what we call the voices from the field. And that's how we identify why is that theme important, what are the challenges related to that theme, and what are some inspiration and initiatives. And then in each theme, we also have identified low-hanging fruits, so things that we think might be practical to implement or easy to implement in kind of a short term to make progress on those fronts. And of course, resources to explore from literature to projects that are going on, things of that nature. And so briefly, just to give you a partial extract from two of our themes, but these are not complete representations of either theme. For the resources theme, we had put this into facilities, equipment, technology, resources of materials and tools, data as a resource, and knowledge as a resource. And we have some example challenges and some example answering inspirations on this slide. So for instance, there's a lack of basic facilities and on-site analytical capabilities, but that could perhaps be answered by developing mobile labs and sharing facilities. For many people, they reported that it's difficult to procure conservation grade materials. So one source of inspiration is using locally available or repurposed materials for conservation. For the data, non-standardized data and file formats can be a big challenge. So one way to answer that might be generalizing the use of open source software. And regarding challenges with access to knowledge, we could reassess the epistemic hierarchies and academic publication standards. And we could do that perhaps by reinventing publication platforms for non-academic content, and as well as publishing work in progress. And so just to tie things up a little bit, I want to also end with a little taste of our theme on rethinking infrastructure. Again, moving from this model of heritage science to heritage care, because it's not just about the access to people and things, the hardware. So for the challenges, we see how can we overcome a lack of basic heritage care facilities. And one answering inspiration is rethinking this infrastructure as an ecosystem. So not just hardware and programs, but really this complex interlinked system of people as well as the stuff. For a challenge of how do you align national interests and general interests, we think one way to answer that is rethinking infrastructure as a network of care. And a network of care is transdisciplinary and either non-hierarchical or having an informal structure, and invites different levels of expertise to participate. For a challenge about how can you make a global infrastructure societally relevant, we were really inspired by the idea of rethinking an infrastructure as a mutual aid project. And so that involves a voluntary and reciprocal exchange of resources and services that result in mutual benefit. And then the last challenge I'm going to share with you today is how could we maintain a global infrastructure on a long-term basis, which requires investment and commitment. And one source of inspiration to answer that is if we rethink infrastructure through inclusive design principles. And so just to end with some images and some food for thought, these are two inclusive design principles that we were very inspired by. Well, I guess a few principles. So here we have three principles of inclusive design. One is recognizing exclusion, another is learning from diversity, and the third is solve for one and then extend to many. And we're combining that with this concept of the curb cut effect, which is an effect that has been proven where if you make a design choice to serve one group, so in this case, it was literally cutting the curb down on a sidewalk to accommodate people who use wheelchairs, then they found that this benefits everyone else. So pedestrians naturally used it, which helps with the traffic flow. People with trolleys or strollers also naturally used it. So while designing for one group, there end up being many, many benefits. So really keeping that in mind when we're thinking about a global infrastructure that is truly global and can serve the needs of heritage care practitioners around the world in all kinds of different settings. And so with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and also acknowledge our project supervisors, coordinator and assistant, our wonderful international advisory committee, literally everyone we spoke to in our research conversations, as well as informal interactions we've had at site visits and conferences just like this one. And of course, none of this would have been possible without the Netherlands Institute for Conservation, Art and Science and generous funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Granice Leyerman, for your presentation. It sounds very interesting project. Okay, this is the end of the presentation session for topic 1. If you have questions regarding the previous 2 presentations, please leave them in our YouTube live chat. I will share it in panel discussion session 2. We will now move on to the panel discussion of topic 1. Dr. Soo-Jung Lee and Professor Florian Kronek from Hong Kong University will be the panelists. We welcome the 2 panelists through Zoom. Okay, this discussion will be conducted in the conversational format. Please feel free to share your thoughts on the previous 2 presentations and on topic 1 for 30 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. If I may start, I would like to thank Professor Kim and the consortium for inviting me to be here, and especially would like to thank Soo-Young and Glenys for your presentations this morning. Soo-Young, I thought with your conclusion that heritage is a cultural process, the conclusion of your talk, or one of the many, that gives us a really good entry point for the discussion. You very well described that process for the projects, the ongoing heritage projects you described in Korea. And what struck me a lot is the ability to rethink the past and to decide what you do in the present in a way to move forward to the future. And to just very briefly, maybe before you answer, to connect that to Glenys's talk, I think the many conversations that the NICASPEC project presented is a good example of that as well, where many different international voices are heard, not just local voices within a single country, to basically move our entire conservation community forward. So do you want to say a little bit more about maybe this process of, on the one hand side, catching up with history? You spoke about some of the previous excavation projects and also exported objects, and maybe the research into original contexts that are either changed or maybe even lost. And then maybe the moving forward with regards to both listening to local voices and maybe accepting, adapting some of the international collaboration for which our consortium certainly stands. Thank you.
Yes, can you hear us? I mean, can you
Yes.
hear me? Okay, thank you very much for your questions and thank you very much for your insight to start the discussions. Yes, I think I would like to start with what I have been thinking these days based on my 20 years experience for doing the PhD in abroad and coming back to Korea to practice based on what I have learned in the international society into the local practice. We do have a huge gap, to be honest, between the decisions which has been made in local practice and the international way of approach. At some point, yes, we all know that we have to integrate the international practice and conservation principle into the local practice, but actually it hasn't been done much in local practice. But what we have to really think, any decisions that we make has been done and will be done by the local people. Not only the heritage professionals in local practice, but also the local communities and everybody who owns the heritage locally. That is their decision and that is our decision as well. So in that case, it is really important for us to understand what has been discussed in the international context and how we can integrate into the local practice is very much important. And I think for the case of Korea, it is the starting point. We do have a lot of money, we do have a lot of technicians and the conservators and the architects and landscape architects as well. And Cultural Heritage Administration government is really focusing on the conservation of heritage as well. But and also we do have the huge list of the what we already recognize as an heritage. But what we are missing at the moment is that we do less discussions on our decisions. We do have a less agreement between the different experts, between the communities and the heritage professionals. To do that, I think international principle and international discussion is going to be the starting point to share our ideas. Maybe the decision, yes, it is important, but actually at the end of the day, decision is not important. The process of what we discuss, what we agree, and how we find the difference between the perspectives is more important. To do that, I think, and also the Cultural Heritage Administration realized that the conservation principle in the Korean context is very much important. That's why we set up the team this year to draft, no matter it is similar to the Western principle or not, it is not important. The process of doing it and starting the discussion between the experts and the site managers is very much important. That's what we believe. We already went through the public discussions between the experts and the communities as well, just last month, and we had a huge debate on the the sentences, on the terminologies and everything, because, and also we realized that many of the heritage, even experts, do not understand the international context and what is the underlying meaning and how those kind of principles has been actually agreed in international society. First step for us is to understand the history and the development and the ideas and thoughts underneath of the international conservation principles. And then probably we have to strongly and energetically discuss how we can integrate into the cultural heritage sites in Korea, because we do have a kind of our own distinctiveness in the heritage values and the sites. And that is the first point that I would like to stress, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is really a brilliant contribution, because you highlight, I think, problems that exist the world over, and you speak about, as you say, a highly developed, a very wealthy country. So I'm sure that many regions are having more severe problems actually answering or trying to find solutions for the same questions, and maybe also facing this difference between conservation and restoration in the first place, and then the many different development stages of a conservation science that I think is also probably understood quite differently in different parts of the world. With that in mind, I think the collaboration within the consortium and the NICA study, so the idea of listening to local voices and striving for international collaboration, I mean, the approach that you also named is certainly very, very valuable. And I think in your conservation principles, that value-based approach, so the identifying, managing, and sharing values, is a very smart model to bring together different voices. Could you maybe say a little bit more about this really value, the search for value I guess the demonstration of value in some ways, and then maybe an agreeing on values to move forward.
Yes, as I explained to you in the earlier videos, and one of my slides shows the cyclic process of the value approach. The first one, as you mentioned, is identifying values, and the second one probably would, sustaining values and preserving the values, and the last one is sharing those kind of values and finding a new values with the public, so that we can use heritage as a resource in our lives. And those cyclic process will be kind of repeating because, and to be honest, in Korea, once we designate as a national heritage site, we do have a certain grade between those kind of sites. We have national treasure, we have national treasure, so those two grades are quite different in terms of the amount of values and the significance. And those kind of grading system can be found in the UK system as well, as far as grade 1 building, grade 2-star building, and so on, right?
And we have it here in Hong Kong as well.
Yes, yes. But when we would like to adjust the grading from treasure to national treasure, we should go on to the value assessment again, because value changes over time, value changes between the different communities.
Mm.
And the conservation principle that we drafted this year would like to understand that international way of thinking, to understand the value and the preserving value and the sharing values. But underneath of that process, we probably have to think now that in that case, what kind of value for the Korean site should be more examined, and what kind of elements to express the value are quite different from the international heritage sites. Is very much local based context that we have to take in from now on. So the conservation principle that we drafted this year, which is going to be translated into English next year, probably you will find it's quite similar conservation principle that you can see from international society or World Heritage System as well, which is value-based approach. But the conservation principles based on the type of the different heritage types, which we are going to continue to develop from next year, that we probably will deal with, and the way that we assess the values probably will be different from the international context, because that is a kind of real practice in deciding the criteria of the value assessment and the grading systems as well. That probably will be quite clear, specific value assessment process we are thinking at the moment. So yes, we do have the international context we reflected in the value-based approach, but we probably will develop the local approach in a kind of detailed guidelines and the detailed principles based on the different types of the site, based on the different types of the buildings and so on in the coming years, I think.
Yeah, thank you, So-young. And I think by doing that, your conservation principles will be extremely valuable to other people. I think both where you adapt international guidelines as well as some of the local examples, because I think what Glenys showed us and the NICAS study proves is that the local voices, even from other regions, and you and I are sort of in the same region, but I mean also all over, are quite valuable to listen to, because I think some countries, some communities certainly face the same challenges. And for example, in the NICAS study, one of Glenys's last slides, the access to resources. So this may not be such a problem in Korea. It shouldn't be a problem, for example, in Hong Kong, where it's also a comparatively wealthy society. But in other parts, I think that is very important. Then many locations, many countries around the world share a dissimilar relationship with colonial powers, but on the other hand are also in some ways joined together, right? Sometimes by, these are sought connections, sometimes maybe forced connections with the colonial past. And I think, and this is also something that can be discussed quite well, and maybe your principles will actually lead to this kind of discussion on how to work with some of the colonial remains, as you say, so some of the buildings, some of the visible, the built past, so where the, in a way, the tangible heritage, and maybe in some ways the intangible heritage is still quite visible, and in some communities, like certainly where I am now, still very much part of a day-to-day life, for better or worse. Do you address some of that in your principles, or is that too specific to be a principle worth a topic to mention?
I would say both. Yes, we did slightly dealt with that issues in detail, but as a kind of overarching principles that we address those kind of issues. So there is a kind of underlying kind of hidden meanings to look at the full history of the heritage sites, all different voices from the different communities within the Korean society, but also the international society. And those kind of overarching principles that we included in the conservation principles. But as I mentioned, in more coming years, that when we draft the detailed guidelines by the different types of the buildings, by different age of the buildings, because most of the colonial heritage belongs to from 1910 to 1945. So based on the different age of the buildings and the sites, then we have to consider a different criteria, or we have to make a kind of balance to let those kind of different voices to be spoken in the statement of significance and the statement of value assessment, I think. So yes, both. We have dealt with those problems as a kind of overarching principles in conservation principles, but at the same time, we have to bear in mind in next few years to include those kind of area, how we can integrate in the detailed guidelines in later on.
Yeah, that brings me to another point, and that is something that Glenys also spoke about. It's this reliance, in a way, or incorporation of a vast network of specialists to listen, in a way, to different representatives, at least, I mean, I guess predominantly of a more scientific community, to respect the differences and maybe search for commonalities and shared values. When I visited Seoul, I was, of course, very struck by both the reinstallation at the National Museum, the example you named, but also the popularity and accessibility of the palace in the city center. And this brings me to another point, and that is obviously public opinion, where I think our work is often maybe more easily discussed among ourselves, and we more easily see, I mean, to use your terms, identify, manage, and share a value. But then could you maybe say a little bit more about the public-facing side that obviously is dear to our hearts, where we all work in the interest of the public, right? We preserve for the nation and are sort of servants to the community.
Yes. It is really important point, as you mentioned, that we internationally we started to talk about the importance of the community, aren't we? We have to respect the public. Previously, experts assess the values, and then those values has been delivered to the public to share. But now we talk about that the public should involve in the value assessment at the beginning. and also they should be a kind of part of the decision makers, not only the experts, but also the public should involve as a decision making. And then they probably will more appreciate the value of the heritage sites at the end. Among the communities, we have not just general public, but as I showed in my slides, we do have a religious community, which is really important. The stupa in the National Museum that you went in, that used to be the Buddhist religious stupa, which should be respected, which should be recognized, and which should allow us to do the circumambulate practice as we do as a Buddhist. Actually, sometimes I find some of the Buddhist people comes into the National Museum and actually they respect that monument as a stupa, religious stupa. So they actually put their hands together and bowing and do, reciting the sutras among they were visiting the site. And also in the Buddhist temple in Korea, we do have a strong voice by the monk communities. And they would like to develop the new buildings to, have the congregations of the Buddhist rituals and so on, because Buddhist sites is a still living place in Korea. And then we do have a conservation expert who would like to keep the layout of the Buddhist temples, and they would like to, keep the building as it was. In that case, in terms of use and function as a religious site, it is quite against the authenticity from the monk's perspective, because use and function is one of the very important authenticity elements and attributes to preserve the religious values for them. In that case, probably it is very much important. Now we realize that we have to listen to their voices from the beginning of the value assessment process, and that should be actually drafted and should be actually mentioned in the conservation principle as well. We have hidden those kind of area under the name of the sustainability, because not only the sustaining values, but also heritage should be working as a kind of resource in a sustainable development of the human being. Then we have to understand and recognize and respect the local voices and the right holders' voices as well. So that's one sentence that we have a kind of reflected those areas that we have to include the public, we have to include the different communities and also stakeholders and right holders in that sentence in conservation principle. And probably I quite expect to develop those kind of area from Korean perspective and the Korean context, how we can invite the public from the beginning of that value-based approach.
Yeah, so Young, I think that's a brilliant point, and especially in conservation, where we often speak about sort of the re-adaptability or the reuse of buildings. What is equally important, and this is a great example, is the continuous use of something that was where the context was changed, right? And where I think it is a really heartwarming example where even in the museum context, and I work for a museum, right? We are always criticized for presenting everything out of context. So in this case, where the as you said, the Buddhist community actually embraces, or some of them embrace the installation and see the ongoing value of the monument like presentation, which is really good. I want to come back maybe to one point you mentioned very early on in your presentation, and that is technology. So Glenys said very briefly, she mentioned the term silos, and of course we always think of ourselves sitting in ivory tower, so that was a good point to be made, and I think she referred to it both in a geographically as well as in a scientific way, that there are silos in different groups that we need to bring together. Knowing that, and you pointed this out in the very beginning, that Korea is one of the world leaders in technology, do you use technology to bring groups together, to make people more aware of heritage concerns?
Yes, we do. I mean, not only the mobile app, it's quite easy to present the heritage values in heritage sites. Once you just approach to the site, once you approach the site, then your mobile phone can easily display yourself based on your needs and everything. Not only those kind of techniques to the public, but also between the experts. We do have those kind of technologies as well, like BIM, for building recording process, that we do have a kind of those techniques to digitalize the components, each component of the timber structures and store in the huge storage area as a file, so that public can access those kind of files for their use. But at the same time that we are in a kind of technology world and technology era, but at the same time, we are quite critical or skeptical about the technology as well, especially in recording. We used to use the hand and the draftsman used to draw those kind of building survey, but we now realize that building survey by human being is more accurate than the digital technology, than the photographic technologies. So it is a kind of philosophical issue that in what way, what technology to use in what purpose and what function and what the effect of it is very much important, I think. And again, we do have the digital technology team in the Cultural Heritage Administration, which is newly set up this year, and they probably will develop those kind of criteria in every heritage process and every heritage presentations and understanding heritage and using heritage. Probably they will think about that too as well, I think. I can say that the recent increased national budget are invested into the digital technology in Korea at the moment, and it will last a few more years, so that we have hugely increased our budget, the national budget in recent years, and most of them are pouring into the digital technology at the moment. So I think we are heading toward the more advanced technology, but again, that we have to sit and think carefully then which digital technology is going to be useful and which is not at the end of our practice.
Yeah, very well put. I think that's a really important point, and also the different levels where this technology proves valuable at the moment. I'm really delighted to hear that there's so much money for this and also the development of digital tools. How big is the impact or the contribution, also maybe the financial contribution of some of the large technology companies in Korea, since they are so hugely famous?
I think different from the European countries or maybe Western countries, many of those kind of activities has been done by the government institute. Mm-hmm. So still the private sectors are waiting to take over those kind of area from the government. I think the reason is that we do have the university, like the Korea National University of Cultural Heritage. We do have under the administration, we do have UNESCO Center, we do have the National Research Institute, we do have the National Intangible Cultural Heritage Center, mm-hmm. We do have the National Excavation Center and underwater, and all of those kinds of functions are under the government service. so most of those kind of technology in different fields has been developed by the governmental institute. And that's why the governments are securing the budget for themselves. The way of using it and the effect of the benefits of those kind of technology probably will be delivered to the publics. And also they will give us another area that the private sector can come in and to take over those kind of technologies to develop further for the publics in later periods. But at the moment, I think the government is a kind of authority to secure the money and to, you know, design all those kind of different fields of technology to develop for the time being, I think.
Yeah, and I guess the government-supported scientific institutions that you named are really leading the way. But on the other hand, if I understand you correctly, there's also still more opportunity maybe for these public-private partnerships to develop. Yeah,
true. Yeah, true.
That's wonderful. I think on this bright note, I want to thank you and also Glenn again for the NICA's presentation, and I'll hand back to Boramshin. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Florian.
Okay, thank you for sharing good conversation, Dr. Sujong Lee and Professor Florian Krone. Now we will have a long lunch break in Korea. Our next session will start at 5 p.m. Korean Standard Time for Europe and Africa participants. Please come back again, everyone, after around 6 hours. Thank you.